On this Shabbat of memory, Shabbat Zachor, I'm going to open the gates of my own memory a little. In the old LJS of my childhood, there was a wooden surround to the ark on both sides, on the Almemah. That's what the bima was called back then. It had a beautiful dark wooden color. And when it was time for the service to begin, the sound of the organ would swell, and a little panel, which up to then had been invisible, would open in this wooden wall, and the service leaders would walk through it onto the Almema, wearing their robes and carrying their books. Some of them, at least the way I remember it, actually having to duck their heads from the smallness of this Alice in Wonderland door. On New Year morning and the Day of Atonement morning, I remember sitting with my father. I generally sat next to him in the central seats when we got there in time, looking up at the Almema. Rabbi Leslie Edgar seemed to a young boy so formal, solemn, and distant, but Reverend Philip Cohen came across as warmer, softer, and more approachable. We had no car in those days. We would be picked up at home in Kenton by my father's parents, Louis and Ethel Heilbeth. We would get there early in the hope of finding a parking space in Hamilton Terrace, where strangely, back then, you could park diagonally in the middle of the wide road. I remember very little of the content of the services, but distinctly recall not really liking the organ or the operatic style of singing. I might perhaps have enjoyed the sermons, but as a young child I never heard them because people came round to fetch us out for the children's services, opening the huge doors, or at least they seemed huge to me, I was very small, in the front corners and ushering us out up seemingly endless staircases and corridors into separate rooms for each age group. I was very shy and very clumsy, and I didn't enjoy being with other children unless I knew them well. But occasionally, we were lucky to have Miss Moose leading the children's service for my age group. Marjorie Moose was a legendary LJS teacher who, as I remember her, managed to combine in a single glance firmness, discipline, kindness, and affection. She held and indeed loved each group of children as if we were her own, as I suppose in a sense we were. She also taught on a Sunday morning, but then my attendance was extremely erratic. Somewhere in the loft, I still have a report which reads, "Michael would do very well if his attendance were even remotely regular. Signed, Reverend John D. Rayner, head teacher." So many from those days are long departed, but some I remember as a young child are still with us and connected with the community, especially my parents' friends, Bob and Ann Kirk and Eva Feldman, whose son Nicholas was in my year group and whose daughter Deborah was in my sister's year group. There was no bar or bat mitzvah at the LJS in those days. And when the time came for me and Rosemary to study for our confirmations, and I needed to attend more regularly on a Sunday morning, my parents decided to leave LJS and join Wembley Liberal Synagogue in Preston Road, just 10 minutes walk from where we lived. But around the time I went up to Oxford in 1970, my parents rejoined LJS. And for some years, I attended as a guest with them on Rosh Hashanah mornings, enjoying the service and especially the preaching, which I hadn't heard when I was young. In those days, there was a huge contrast in styles between that of Rabbi John Rayner and that of Rabbi Dr. David Goldberg. John was learned, scholarly, thoughtful, and his sincerity shone through everything he said. David was warm and humorous, and had the very unusual skill of making his sermons sound completely spontaneous, even when I'm sure he'd done a lot of preparation. But back then I had no ambition to become a rabbi myself, and I would never have dreamed that I would one day have the honor and privilege of being your scholar in residence. But I do remember occasional sermons from the very soft-spoken and learned teacher, Rabbi Dr. David Goldstein, who was far more of a scholar than I will ever be. May the memory of all the departed rabbis and teachers of this community be for a blessing. They made LJS what it is now, and gave so generously of themselves and their wisdom. As you've heard, in 1 week's time, God willing, I shall be 70 years old. And like many in our age group, I think about my childhood more and more, with an added poignancy now that my parents and sister are gone. Sometimes I think I should write a memoir or even a novel based on those times. The minibus which took us to school when petrol was rationed during the Suez crisis. The great winter of January and February 1963, when there was so much snow, we went shopping with a toboggan for several weeks in order to pull back a box with the shopping in it. The children's party games, which I insisted my friends play again when I became 65. Hearing the story of the Minotaur at school on the radio and having nightmares about it afterwards because it was so terrifying. Noticing our Christian headmaster look at me and the other Jewish boys as he read passages about the Jews from the Gospels. These and so many other memories come crowding in, and no doubt there are others waiting to be uncovered. But most likely, I shall never finish the memoir, because even in a happy childhood like mine, some memories looked at from a distance can be disturbing. And perhaps also because part of me doesn't really want to uncover all the past, but to make more effort as an activist today, campaigning for better mental health provision, more help for our street homeless, the end of the Uyghur genocide, and removing from our world the existential threat of climate change. But then Claire, my wife, as a historian, reminds me that all these issues and so many others are illumined by an understanding of history, and she is right. When the Israelites of old brought their contributions for the tabernacle in the desert, they used the rich materials they had taken from the Egyptians to construct the first house of God in our history. They used their own past to plan for their future, and not just their own future, but generations to come. And so I think that my generation, the baby boomers as we are known, should now be in the forefront of thinking about the long-term future of our society and our planet. When I became 60, I made a resolution to take myself less seriously. There was no need anymore to make an impression or to build a career, so I could lighten up and have fun. But as the Scottish poet Robert Burns observed in his poem To a Mouse, the best laid schemes are mice and men gang after gley. I suspect Burns must have learned a little Yiddish along with his Scots, for that sentiment surely derives from a Yiddish proverb which means man plans and God laughs. Der Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. Certainly some fun things have happened to me in the last 10 years, but also some highly serious and indeed tragic events. As I approach 70, I feel more serious than 10 years ago. Our life 70 feels much more than 60 about how to use whatever time remains, to make use of the knowledge with which God has blessed me, to teach and to learn, to build connections and to build peace. May our world emerge from the sorrow and strain of this pandemic a brighter, more connected and happier place, so that, as the psalmist said, Hazorim bedima berina yiksoru, those who sow in tears will reap in joy, will reap in joy. Shabbat Shalom.